Okay, next thing is metabolic pathways. This is, I guess, kind of a big one, but so let's just take a metabolic pathway. Let's take for example, let's take turning glucose, because that's the one we're going to be talking about here. So turning glucose into CO2 and water and 36 ATP. I could just take some sugar and I could light a match and light that sugar on fire, and all the energy in that sugar would be released instantly. It would get super hot. A little bit of sugar would go boom, and it would get super hot. That's no good for the body, right? Because if you did it that way, you have no control. Once you've started that reaction, you've got no control. All that sugar is now burning all at once. It's releasing a massive amount of heat. If that happened inside your body, it would destroy the cell that it's in. So instead, we have metabolic pathways. We do it just, we take that sugar apart just a little bit at a time. We take it apart kind of bond by bond, right? We're breaking the bonds a little bit at a time. So that's the advantage of metabolic pathways, is that you have control and you're spreading out the reaction. So you need less activation energy and you can control the energy that's released. Then there's like a question about what's the difference between cellular respiration and carbohydrate metabolism, because they sound like the same thing, right? Cellular respiration, we always talk about that sugar, the mitochondria does cellular respiration. Well, the metabolic, there's actually 3 different pathways, metabolic pathways for cellular respiration, because there's one for lipids and there's one for proteins and one for carbohydrates, so one for sugars. So that's why it's called cellular respiration, because you can respire proteins and you can respire lipids, so you can break down those parts of your body, right? That's why, and to go into those, that's why you have to starve yourself if you want to lose weight, because your body will then finally be like, fine, I'll do the harder thing, because it's harder for it to do the protein. It's not as efficient to break down proteins and lipids so fast. There you go. That's why starving yourself works. Although with teenagers, you get crazy and you start like that's a mental illness, is anorexia and stuff. So don't starve yourselves. You guys are young and fit, and don't do that. Next. Oh man, I'm gonna end up in that book just probably because of this video or something. The Bad Teacher, but there's a Bad Teacher book. So, but carbohydrate, when we just talk about carbohydrate, the difference between cellular respiration and carbohydrate metabolism is just the pathway of breaking down sugar. So let's talk about the pathway of breaking down sugar sort of in detail. So the first half is called glycolysis. So when you eat when you have sugar, there's a little glucose goes into your cells, and now your blood cell, your muscle cell, or whoever's got to now get that energy out. So it does this thing called glycolysis, and glycolysis has 3 steps. First step is phosphorylation. And so the phosphate groups from 2-ATP get that sugar gets those phosphate groups attached to it. So it burns up 2-ATP. Now remember, ATP is the energy currency of the cell. And also what happens is that the glucose gets turned into fructose with now 2 phosphates attached to it, and the fructose is broken. Okay, so phosphorylation is just when the glucose gets turned into fructose and it's got extra phosphate groups. That's why it's fructose. Then the second step of glycolysis is sugar cleavage. The fructose gets broken in 2, and fructose is a 6-carbon sugar, just like glucose is a 6-carbon sugar. So when it gets broken in 2, 6 divided by 2 is 3. So now it's a 3-carbon sugar. It's actually it's an aldehyde, but whatever. And it's got one, and each of those sugars has that phosphate group that we got from those ATP. Then a vitamin comes along, right? NAD, there's vitamins, right? That's one of those cofactors. It's helping the enzyme. And what that enzyme does is it does things. And anyways, in the end, with the vitamin and the enzyme from each of those aldehydes, but let's say those 3 carbon sugars, it takes those phosphate groups away and some other stuff, and it makes 2 ADPs per, excuse me, 2 ADPs per 3 carbon sugar. So our net from glycolysis is 2 ATP, right? We used up 2 at the beginning, we made 4, the net is 2. Now, bacteria stop here. They're like, 2 ATP, I love 2 ATP, I can live off 2 ATP. And they can live off 2 ATP, no problemo. The product is pyruvate. Pyruvate can go be an acid and be all kinds of stuff. Devour the enamel in your teeth. That's where, right, that's the products of bacteria. That's why they cause harm. Or devour or give you abscesses or whatever crazy thing that bacteria do. So that's, bacteria stop there. Eukaryotic cells, our cells, continue on. They're like, wait a minute, there's still energy in that pyruvate. I want to use up more, I want to do more with that pyruvate. So it takes that pyruvate, shoves it into mitochondria. There's the electron chain, cellular respiration, Krebs cycle in mitochondria. This has to happen. Now you need an oxygen molecule. At this point you need oxygen. It's an aerobic process. And it basically burns that pyruvate, waters the product, carbon dioxide's the product, and 36 ATP are the product. 36. That is huge. That's why ATP, or that's why mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, because they make 36 ATP from pyruvate. Prokaryotes are dumping that. They don't know how to do it. They can't do it. We rule, okay? Eukaryotes for life. So now the net of all of that, that cellular respiration, the net is we used up 2 ATP in the first thing in phosphorylation. We made 4, so we had 2, and then we made 2 ATP, and then we made 36 from the Krebs cycle. So altogether, eukaryotes per 1 glucose molecule make 38 ATP. 38 ATP. Now, so yeah, aerobic respiration produces 38 ATP, with the oxygen and all that stuff. Now, sometimes there's just not enough oxygen. There's no oxygen. So our muscle cells are famous for this. This happens in muscle cells. Say you're running, you're going for a big run, and your cardiopulmonary system is just not keeping up with your muscles. Your muscles will be like, fine. What we will do is there's no oxygen. The oxygen takes up carbon. It does a sort of thing. So it goes, well, we're going to do some fermentation. And that produces lactate. In the end, it does fermentation. It produces lactate. Now, for some reason, I didn't write down here, does fermentation produce ATP, or if there's no O2. Oh, brother. I'm not going to ask you any questions about that. Anyways, but there is a question about it, is that it produces lactic acid. Fermentation in animals produces lactic acid. Fermentation in plants produces ethanol. So fermentation is important because, hey, what's ethanol used for, Mr. K? Well, it's used for making beer and wine. So there you go. That's if you take a bunch of sugar, dump a bunch of, strawberries or grapes into a jug, cork up the jug so there's no O2. You actually are supposed to throw in yeast. This is why I'm always confused that it says in plants, but anyways, whatever. Because it's always yeast that makes the alcohol. Maybe the yeast uses up the oxygen and the plants do the fermentation. That could be something. Anyways, the lactic acid, then so that's why, after a big run or a big workout, when you've actually been doing anaerobic respiration there in your muscles, the lactic acid is where the pain, the soreness comes from. At least that's the going theory. And then what can happen is in animals, the lactic acid will stick around And when there is enough oxygen, when you've stopped running, your body will just take that lactic acid and throw it into the Krebs cycle, or it'll do something where it'll turn it into pyruvate and then throw it into the Krebs cycle. So you end up getting those 36 ATP from that lactic acid. Yeah, that's what it is. That's what it is. So fermentation doesn't produce ATP. You're just getting those 2 ATP out of the other thing, but the pyruvate has to go somewhere and it's harmful, so it turns into lactate. In plants, the ethanol, there's no going back. So it's not a reversible, we can't make more ATP from it, so we can't go back to pyruvate from ethanol because like CO2 is released or something. There's more CO2 released, so it makes bubbles. It makes like beer bubbles, and you can't go back. So that you're stuck with the alcohol. The plants are stuck with the alcohol. Oh no. Okay, last thing, here we go. Feedback systems, B5 feedback systems. Negative feedback, positive feedback. Negative feedback maintains homeostasis. So an example of that here, the one we have, is my body's at 37 degrees centigrade. I'm in a hot room. It's hot in here. Oh no, but I'm exothermic, endothermic. I'm endothermic. So I have a negative feedback system for that. Whereas my body the temperature starts to go up, I start to sweat, the blood gets pumped to my extremities, and now there's evaporation starts to happen, and there's a negative feedback to the condition. The temperature starts to go down. I go back down to 37 degrees. Homeostasis is maintained. I might go down too far. I might get too cold, and then I've got to bring it back up. There's a thing for that too. So when the temperature goes down, I start to shiver. I get goosebumps. It's debate. I mean, we have little hairs on our bodies. So you know, those goosebumps create a layer of insulation. When the hair is puffed up, now there's air trapped under that layer of hair, and that air acts as insulation. It's like a wetsuit kind of thing, but a dry suit. Humans, that's sort of a vestigial thing from when we were more ape-like and we had lots of fur. Because we really don't have that much fur we don't you know, whatever, it's not a thing, but we shiver and we bring our blood into our center, as we talked before, we'll sew a jacket really quickly, we'll sew a sweater really quickly, and so then our temperature starts to go up and there's a negative feedback loop. Positive feedback loops break homeostasis. Their job is to break homeostasis. So I've seen this happen twice. Is birth. During birth, oxytocin, the contractions, muscle contraction. You know, like we'll learn about that. The luteal, when the fetus grows big enough, the baby grows big enough. There's a stretching. The stretching triggers the release of oxytocin. Oxytocin. Get positive reinforcement to start contractions. When there's a contraction, the actual act of contractions causes the release of more oxytocin, which causes more contractions, which causes more oxytocin, which causes more contractions, which causes more oxytocin, more and more, until finally there's a baby in the room. And now that's the end condition. And then new processes take over where they're like, get rid of that oxytocin. You know, you birth the placenta. And you birth the placenta, and that's because that thing is producing a lot of oxytocin. But don't quote me on that because I haven't looked at that part yet. So all the oxytocin is gone all of a sudden. But I think that's right-ish. Funny story. No, it's not a funny story. I don't know. One of our kids, we never made it to the hospital, so they were born in the house. We didn't make it. The kid came too quickly. I almost delivered the baby. And then we were like, there's a placenta. Where do we put the placenta? Someone put it in the freezer, and then it got forgotten about. And then my nice mom was here to make food for people. And she's like, oh, I found this frozen thing in the thing. Can I make this? And we were like, no! And we'll end it on that.